That was beautiful. Thank you. I love that song. Thank you, Patricia, for platforming today. Thank you for that prayer. It was lovely. Thank you. Thank you. And Julie, lovely as usual. Thank you. Aren't our chaplains wonderful? Such a joy to have such wonderful chaplains and to work with them. Thank you. And to Bob for recording, and to Kevin for being our Zoom operator. And let's see. And for Harry and David for doing the slides. Harry's got the helm this morning. And then, of course, for President Duffy, who's of our board, who's just everywhere, everywhere. And so, what stories have you been telling yourself today? You got any stories going on? I do. Good. I have stories going on. I always have stories going on. I have stories going on about you. I have stories going on about me. I have stories going on about the neighbor. Oh, my goodness. I have stories going on about things that happened when I was 9 years old. I have stories going on about things that haven't even happened yet that I'm stopping from happening. What kind of stories do you have going on? We all have stories going on. Remember that we're thought machines, and how can we be thought machines and not have stories going on? And how do we stop having stories? I mean, wouldn't it be nice to not be having these stories about everything, especially about me? I mean, some of the stories that I'm telling myself about me are far-fetched, you know, but I'm going to keep the one that keeps telling me I'm 36. That one I'm going to keep. And when I look in the mirror, I'm going to say, yes, you are. Yes, yes, you are 36. And, you know, in this moment, that's okay. That's okay. I know what I'm doing in this moment. So let's keep in mind our stories. Let's keep in mind the present moment. And I want to ask you right up front to join me for the next 3 weeks in a spiritual practice. I want to ask you to join me in the spiritual practice of stepping back from one moment, and in the next moment, see and hear the moment differently. See and hear the moment differently than you did in the previous moment. Step away from the story, step away from the initial impression, step away from what you thought you heard and what you thought you saw, what the stories that you've got going on in your mind, what your white privilege or black unprivilege or what your whatever tells you that is going on. Stop and hear it and see it a little differently. So for the next 3 weeks, I want to ask you to try doing this, to see and hear from the I am, to see and hear differently, to really be in that present moment. There's the present moment and then the next moment. And we get a chance to see and hear it differently in the next moment. We get a chance to stop, take a breath, and see and hear differently. So we'll come back to that spiritual practice in a few minutes, but as in the chat time before we were starting, Pat Sweet said to me, "What is that you have behind you, Reverend Rich? Is that book say The Naked Now?" And I said, "Well, it does, Pat, yes." My sister told me I shouldn't be talking about that from the pulpit. And I said, now, wait a minute. And so we're going to be talking about the book, about Richard Warr's book, about some of Richard Warr's teachings. And in The Naked Now, we're talking about the present moment, the now, the present moment, and we're seeing it from a naked perspective. It's not clothed in anything. It's not clothed in my story. It's not clothed in your story. It's not clothed in my parents' story. It's not clothed in anything. It's the naked moment. It's the naked now. It's without our humanness attached to it. Now, remember last week, we talked about embodying kindness. And one of the things we talked about last week is that to embody kindness, intimacy is key. When we become intimate with ourselves, we realize that we're going through something, that we're always going through something. Remember that? We're always going through something. And then we realize that everyone is always going through something. And so the beauty of being human, and it's also the pain of being human, is that everyone is going through something. And that if we can realize it, we can realize that everybody's just like me, that we can begin to know kindness, to embrace kindness, to feel kindness, to be in the now moment with kindness. To be in the now moment with kindness, to be in the present moment. Marcia denote, it's Richard Warr, because I was just going to say that. Marcia asked in the chat the name. It's Warr, R-O-H-R. Richard Warr was born in Kansas in 1943. He received his Master's of Theology degree in 1970 from the University of Dayton, and he entered the Franciscan order in 1961 and was ordained to the priesthood in 1970. He founded the New Jerusalem community in Cincinnati, Ohio in 71, and then in 86, he formed the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he is still there and is the Dean of the Living School of Action and Contemplation. And the curriculum of Rohr's school is founded on 7 themes developed by Rohr, and he explores them in his book, Yes, and. So Martha will be talking about and. So we'll hear a little bit more about that next week. But what does Richard Warr believe? You know, he's a contemplative. So he's taking the time to contemplate, to decide, to go inside, to be in the presence, to be present in making decisions, in getting beliefs, in making statements, in seeing and hearing. He's a contemplative. Warr emphasizes what he calls alternative orthodoxy, a term the Franciscan tradition has applied to itself, referring to a focus on orthopraxis, a belief that lifestyle and practice are much more important than mere verbal orthodoxy, which he feels is much overlooked in Catholic preaching today. Duh. Yes, and isn't that what New Thought is all about? That lifestyle and practice are much more important than verbal orthodoxy. We have to put it into action, don't we? We can talk and we can pray and we can hold it in mind, but unless we put it into action and we move away from that verbal orthodoxy, that talk and no action. So that Rohr comes from that presence, and in The Naked Now, he describes the mystical experience as a place of deep presence, deep presence. So he tells the story in The Naked Now. He says, standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon for the first time, I was struck by the intersection of the past and the future in a single moment of eternal now. I sensed the immense forces that carved this gorge in the earth, the wind, the water, and time. As a physical experience of time, this great canyon stretched into the past and future. Constant change happened even as I stood there in stillness, doing nothing, being with the moment. Time seemed to stand naked before me in this ever-present naked now. Perhaps this moment is similar to what the mystics experience. Perhaps it is the moment that I get lost in the gaze of a newborn, the timelessness of hours spent with a close friend, and the effortlessness of a creative flow. And if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon and just stood, you can see the naked nowness of the moment, the awe, the awness of awe, the awe of the moment, the future and the past, and that the present moment is more than what in the human experience we usually bring to it. Warr says that he's primarily concerned with why people do not see very well and how we perhaps can. What is it that keeps us humans from reading reality truthfully, humbly, and helpfully, Warr says? Why do we, including people at the highest levels of church, education, and state, appear to be so imprisoned in ourselves? Why do we appear to be so imprisoned in ourselves? We can see that in the world today. We can see that in the essences of Patricia's prayer about what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia. Why are we so imprisoned in ourselves that we can't see peace in this moment, that we can't see and hear peace? In effect, why have we told people that they must believe in God in order to experience God, when God is clearly at work in ways that many eyes have not seen, nor ears have not heard, nor has it entered into our minds? Warr quotes Corinthians there, the 2nd chapter, verse 9. Why is it that so many of us haven't seen the work of the universe, the work of beauty, the work of the world, the awesomeness? Why do we come from ourselves, from our humanness, rather than our spiritual being? Warr says, and I love this, that one man sees the sunset and enjoys the physical beauty of the event. Like the majority of people, his world consists of what he can see, feel, touch, move, and fix. A sentient being. The second man also enjoys the physical beauty, but he uses the power of his mind to understand and make sense of the universe. He understands the rotation and movement of the earth and sun that make the sunset possible. He enjoys seeing the world in this expanded way. You see, we all know that. We all know that about the rotation of the earth and about the movement and what causes sunset. But do we stop and see it in that moment? Are we willing to, or are we afraid to see it from that perspective? Instead of having those stories that are useless going on in our mind, can we stop and see the world from the perspective of the universe, of the realm of all that we are, and from a spiritual being? The third man sees with the eyes of the first, enjoying the physical beauty, and the eyes of the second, the eye of understanding, but also experiences the awe and the mystery, the awe and the mystery. When you stop and think about contemplative prayer, the rosary, the awe and mystery of the cross, the first mystery of the cross, the second mystery of the cross, the mystery of the world, the mystery of the church, the mystery of awe. Third eye seeing is the way that the mystics see. They do not reject the first eye. The senses matter to them, but they know there is more. Nor do they reject the second eye, Warr tells us, but they know not to confuse knowledge with depth or mere correct information with the transformation of consciousness itself. Warr says that the mystical gaze builds upon the first two eyes, and yet goes farther. It happens whenever, by some wondrous coincidence, our heart space, our mind space, and our body awareness are all simultaneous, open, and non-resistant. I like to call it presence, he says. I do too. I like to call it presence as well. It is experienced as a moment of deep inner connection, and it always pulls you, intensely satisfied, into the naked and undefended now, which can involve both profound joy and profound sadness. At that point, all you either want to write poetry, pray, or be utterly silent. At that point, you either want to write poetry, pray, or be utterly silent to experience the joy of it, the profound joy or the profound sadness of it. Allowing yourself to feel that is what Warr calls us to do in The Naked Now, to really feel, to move into, if we're feeling sadness, to allow that sadness into us and to feel it in that moment, and then move into the next moment and see it differently. Can you do that? Can you move into the naked now? Can you do it with faith? Warr says that yes, the mind is brilliant, but the more we observe it, the more we realize it is also obsessive and repetitive. Yes. The mind is also obsessive and repetitive, isn't it? Yes. Yes, the mind can serve the world, but in fact, it largely serves itself. We still think of ourselves as mere humans trying desperately to become spiritual, when the Christian revelation was precisely that you are already spiritual, and your difficult but necessary task is to learn how to become human. Think about that. You're already spiritual, and then your difficult task is to learn to become human. Yes. And so let's not forget our spiritual being when we're learning to become human. Warr says that we moved from wondering to answering, which has not served us well. We've stopped wondering why there's so many stars and what's on them. Is there anybody on them? And we've just taken answers in and said, well, that's that star and it's in that galaxy, instead of wondering. We've become afraid to wonder. We've put answers in, like the Garden of Eden. We've put answers in, like the creation story that all cultures put in. We stopped wondering. Warr says, when you are concerned with either attacking or defending, manipulating or resisting, you cannot be contemplative. When you are preoccupied with enemies, you are always dualistic. When you are preoccupied, when you've got stories going on about enemies, you're always being dualistic. You're not in the one moment, you're in several moments, you're in several places. And how can you see and hear the awesomeness, what this human experience is all about? Warr says you normally have to let go of the old and go through a stage of unknowing or confusion before you can move to another level of awareness or new capacity. Brahma tells us that in Finding Yourself in Transition. He calls it the void. Through a stage of unknowing and confusion before we can move to another level or capacity. So over the next 3 weeks as we practice, don't beat yourself up for having difficulty in stepping back and seeing in the present moment. It's what we normally do. We don't want to do that. So let go, deny any power to that, and affirm that you're going to see through the present moment now. Warr says that we see what we are ready to see, expect to see, and even desire to see. Oh boy, I can be guilty of that. Seeing what I desire to see and walking down that rabbit hole. Geez, no, thank you. Warr says, for him, the ability to stand back and calmly observe my inner dramas without rushing to judgment is foundational for spiritual seeing. It is the primary form of dying to self that Jesus lived personally and the Buddha taught experientially. The growing consensus is that whatever you call it, such calm, egoless seeing is invariably characteristics of people at the highest levels of doing and loving in all cultures and religions. They are the ones we call sage or wise women or holy men. They see like the mystics see. So this week, I ask you to begin your practice of seeing like the mystics see. You always, we're always talking, we're always going, well, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I make that shift? Stepping back, taking a breath, and allowing you to see or self to see or hear as the mystics see and hear from that I am place. You ask me, how do I move into right thinking? I step back for a moment and see and hear it differently. How do I let the 12 powers work in me? I step back for a moment and take a breath and see it, hear it differently. How do I move from resistance to non-resistance? I step back for a moment and breathe and see and hear it differently. How do I give and receive forgiveness? And I step back for a moment and I see and hear it differently in the next moment. How do I move? This is a good one. Remember this. How do I move from my parasympathetic nervous system to my sympathetic nervous system? Well, I step back and I breathe for a moment and see and hear it differently. I move from that parasympathetic, and startle and respond from that to my sympathetic. I tell my parasympathetic, no, we don't need to flight or fright. We can calmly look at this moment and approach it from the I am. How do I let go and let God? I take a breath and I step back and I see it and hear it differently. How do I see as the mystics see? Well, I step back, I take a breath, and for a moment I see it and hear it differently. So let's see as the mystics see together. Go forward this week, step back for a moment and see it and hear it differently. Thank you. Have a good week and blessings to each of you.